Hello there. Welcome to Best Practices for Working with EAL Consumers. My name is Kitty Taylor, and I am a current intern at the Kentucky Office of Vocational Rehabilitation as an MSW student at Arizona State University. In this training, we're going to explore some best practices and methods to use when working with consumers who are acquiring English as an additional language. You may be more familiar with the term English as a second language, or ESL, but after this training, hopefully you will recognize the difference between the two and why using English acquiring learning is a more appropriate term. For now, just know that when you see EAL in the slides, this is referring to individuals who are acquiring English as an additional language. So let's get started. Let's talk about why we're here. As a certified rehabilitation counselor at the Kentucky Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, you know that providing equal opportunities to any qualifying applicant is paramount to the work that you do. We will be covering a variety of different consumers in this training, but this training is not designed to teach you how to solve all challenges that come from provided services to diverse groups. This training is about providing tools to better help you serve a diverse population who may use OVR services. Let's look at what diverse groups we are referring to for this training. Community members who may represent individuals acquiring English as an additional language are immigrant communities, refugees and asylum seekers, isolated indigenous groups, and children within these groups who may have their own level of English acquirement that differ from their elders. Consumers in these groups can face a multitude of challenges, including systemic oppression, discrimination, and erasure. In this training, we want to explore what those challenges may be and how we can practice harm reduction to give them a better experience with their time at the Kentucky Vocational Rehabilitation Center. As stated, we won't be able to cover every way you can practice harm reduction, but we want to give you an overview of how to recognize various cultures and understand what types of services can be provided to them. We'll do this by looking at the ecological model and how we can use it to counteract the effects of oppression, discrimination, and trauma. Ecological systems theory, or EST, gives us an understanding of how people are shaped by their environments and how they, in turn, can shape the environments around them. The diagram you see here shows how an individual's environment affects their behavior, experiences, mental health, and well-being. In the middle is their microsystem, which includes individual life interactions like close family, friends, and personal health. Outside the microsystem, we move on to their mesosystem, which includes group interactions and dynamics like an individual's school and work. Next, we have their exosystems, which are their more removed groups like local governments. Their macrosystem are the larger scale interactions like social norms and national government. And finally, an individual's chronosystem are any experience and interaction that they have within a time frame. Understanding these various levels of an individual's life experience gives you a better understanding of how they have been shaped by the world around them and also how they themselves have influenced that world. The ecological model also illustrates how an individual reacts and adapts to stressors in their environment. Their reaction and adaptation can be influenced by their past experiences, support systems, and systems of oppression. Included in support systems are coping skills, an individual's problem-solving ability, their resilience, community resources they may have access to, and their family and social supports. Take some time here with this diagram and see if you can match which support systems belongs to which part of the ecological model. On the other side of that coin, let's look at the negative aspects of an individual's ecological model. There are various levels of oppression. They can be personal discrimination, systemic oppression, racism and perceived racism, and trauma. Marginalized groups will often have long histories of discrimination that they have experienced in their personal and professional lives. These experiences carry to future encounters they have with other individuals in their lives. Some groups also have generational histories of being oppressed by the systems that they live under. These systems include government entities, medical facilities and professionals, and school and academic institutions. Sometimes mistrust of oppressive systems can be transferred to you as a professional at an agency. When serving someone who may seem reserved, nervous, or hostile, understand that this can come from a place of trauma. Refugees have typically fled war or political and religious persecution, and migrants tend to flee areas of high poverty and little opportunities. Immigrants can have none of those challenges, but still experience a significant culture shock, homesickness, and difficulty learning a new language and navigating systems in that language. Trauma is also generational. Many cultures hold trauma based on persecution of their people. When working with this demographic, keep in mind these traumas can follow. How an individual reacts to you and the services can be influenced by their past experiences with systems and institutions, and whether they've been positive or negative. It is not uncommon for members of these groups to have experience with racism, xenophobia, and being subjected to stereotypes. These experiences are not limited to one-on-one interactions or in social settings. They happen at the institutional level often. Understanding that an individual may be wary of services due to having those experiences with other agencies will help you recognize why a consumer may be reserved or have hesitations about sharing information or being trusting. It's important to respond by not taking these reservations personally, but to use it as an opportunity to work with the individual on ways to move forward and build trust. In addition to language acquirement, you may work with consumers who have cognitive disabilities. There is little research on best methods for service for an individual with these disabilities, but let's go over what we do know. First, understand that attitudes towards those with intellectual disabilities can vary across cultures. In many cultures, it is a taboo subject that is difficult to approach, and it can be challenging to provide them with accepting necessary services that can help both in their progress and you. In other words, you may have challenges approaching individuals or their family members about various services that address cognitive disabilities. Second, those with intellectual disabilities have challenges with phonological memory, which is remembering sounds, and processing information, making it more difficult to learn an additional language. Consumers with cognitive disabilities may struggle with their native language, as well as have challenges learning an additional language. Finally, it can be challenging for you as the counselor to distinguish between the cognitive disability and the language barrier. Familiarizing yourself with the differences between the two can be beneficial for communication. Some of the practices we will discuss, like decentering English or translation services, can help you recognize which obstacle you are facing with a consumer. So to review, we can use the ecological model to gain knowledge about how those acquiring English, such as immigrants, refugees, or migrants, are affected by societal inequities in their new home based on their language capacity, disability, culture, race, and ethnicity. This helps us be aware of the societal inequities they may face and how that affects their well-being. It's also a way that we as service providers can use this knowledge to provide culturally responsive resources that can improve these disparities in societal inequities. We can further use it to address common challenges such as intergenerational differences within migrant families, culture shock, trauma, particularly for refugee families, and various language capacities within the family unit. All in all, the ecological model provides a blueprint for responding to the needs of our consumers. Next, let's talk about some common biases that those who are acquiring English may face. Americans live in a generally monolingual society. Because of this, many of the institutions have few tools that effectively serve EAL individuals other than to provide translation services that are usually outsourced. These translation services are great, but don't address how to work with individuals learning English with humility and harm reduction, and do not help unpack what implicit biases those acquiring English may be facing. I mentioned at the beginning that we would be using the term EAL instead of the more common term like ESL. We changed this term because English as a second language assumes English would be someone's second language when they can speak multiple other languages as well. There may be biases we are taught about non-English speakers or English learners, so let's unpack a few of the best practices for addressing implicit bias. First, being aware of biases is not just about reflecting on our own opinions and how we form them, but also acknowledging that those biases have probably already been experienced by the consumer at one point or another from either individuals or institutions. Working towards better understanding and breaking down of biases reduces the risk that you continuing to do that cycle. Second, be aware of the common cultures within your area of service, and also aware of the local agencies in your area that serve those communities. It will be impossible to know them all, of course, but there will be trends of larger communities that you can be aware of. What are the most common languages you hear in your area besides English? What large immigration groups do you have locally? What resource centers, language centers, or cultural centers are local that can be utilized? These are all important pieces of recognizing the various cultures around you and where you or the consumer may seek further assistance if needed. Finally, adopt anti-racist and anti-ethnocentric practices. Anti-racism requires active resistance to and the dismantling of systems of racism. Still, this is a broad term. What do we mean? Part of practicing anti-racism is being aware of stereotypes. So the aggressive Black woman, the uneducated Latinx person, the lazy young person, or the non-tech savvy elder. We are all taught stereotypes, and many seem harmless until we unpack them. Think about some stereotypes you have been taught throughout your life, and ways that those stereotypes may be used against someone in broader society. Then think of some ways you can work to counteract those assumptions and how they have harmed others. Specifically with English acquirement, a common stereotype is that those who either don't speak English or speak English with an accent are not as intelligent as those who are English fluent and have no accent. Ethnocentrism dictates that our own cultures and languages are superior to others. However, a difference in language and culture does not equal an inferior language or culture. Also, the level of language acquirement can exacerbate these biases. Recognizing that language level fluency has different stages and has no bearing on intelligence level is going to benefit you. This is especially true in business settings like ours, where official documentation has more advanced levels of English that are much more difficult to understand. Implicit bias and ethnocentrism can be conscious or subconscious. We may not recognize them, but we are all products of the systems we were raised in, and we were all taught biases. Implicit bias is a negative attitude that we may not be consciously aware we have towards a specific group. Ethnocentrism is the attitude that one's own group, ethnicity, culture, or nationality is superior to others. Keep in mind that overarching anti-immigrant sentiments and xenophobia can be exacerbated by racism, linguicism, and ableism, which might be further complicated by gender oppression, heterosexism, classism, anti-Semitism, or Islamophobia. In other words, these issues build off each other and create hierarchies of further oppression. Other types of biases that may be less known but not less present are affect heuristic bias, confirmation bias, anchoring bias, and conformity bias. So let's talk about what these mean. Affect heuristic bias is an opinion formed based on your current mood or emotional state. Confirmation bias means we look for things to confirm the bias we hold and ignore other aspects that do not confirm those biases. Anchoring bias is when we hold opinions about a specific type of person based on a past experience that we may have had with someone from that group. We can perceive these opinions as positive or negative, but that may not be the case for the groups we hold them for. And finally, conformity bias is opinions that are influenced by feelings of pressure to belong to the greater majority, even if we don't agree with those opinions. Think about examples of each of these biases you may have had experiences with. So now that we've looked at various levels of biases and discussed English fluency versus intelligence, let's do an exercise to illustrate what we mean by English proficiency and assumptions we make about those acquiring English. Let's say you speak enough of a language to carry on short common conversations. You can order food, ask directions, and have basic daily conversations. Most people fluent in that language would consider you to understand that language well. Now let's say you need to go to the doctor that only speaks the language that you know at the conversational level, and they hand you a document to fill out. This is the document. Try to read it. You see there's some familiar words, and maybe you can even guess at what some of the others mean. but there's enough misunderstanding that you're not able to interpret what the document is for or what it's saying. The purpose of this exercise is to give an example of people perceiving you as having adequate skills in a particular language, but your comprehension level is limited to one of the following. You understand much of the language, but you can't speak it. You can carry on everyday conversations, but cannot speak in technical terms. You can speak the language, but can't read it and have no educational background in that language. Or you can speak and read the language, but at a very limited level. Language fluency is complicated and layered, and EAL individuals will have various levels of that fluency. Remember when working with consumers who are acquiring English that you may need to check in to see if they have enough comprehension of documents to give informed consent or understand services being provided. Remember, you are not supposed to be able to unpack all of your biases overnight. This is a lifelong practice that constantly shifts. That's why we call it practicing cultural humility instead of cultural competency. Being competent in a culture implies that you have nothing left to learn. Whereas when practicing cultural humility, we are always students, maybe even of our own cultures. Part of practicing cultural humility is recognizing that someone's fluency or competence in English is not a reflection of their intelligence. It's one thing to recognize that biases and ethnocentrism exists, but it's not as easy to know how to put in practice actions that create harm reduction. So the next section of our training, we will go over some simple practices that will give you the ability to do just that. There are many practices we can put in place to make other cultures and English learning individuals feel welcome. For our limited time, we'll be talking about 3. The first is having an affirming agency culture. What this means is implementing best practices agency-wide for counselors and staff to better understand and serve EAL consumers. This can include adopting anti-racist and welcoming language into outreach information, paperwork, internal policies, and outward reporting. Ensuring that this is a cultural shift interwoven into all aspects of the agency and not just token trainings or one-off meeting topics provides consistency and better supports staff as well. There may already be some of these practices in place, so see if you can identify some of these practices in your agency that are already implemented, and then maybe think of some that aren't. We'll get into some examples in a moment to give you some ideas. Second, consider some ways you can decenter English in communication. I referenced this practice earlier, but what does it mean to decenter English? What we're saying is that we can not use English as the main form of communication if there are other ways to communicate information. This is especially important in early stages of rapport building with your consumers. Again, I'll give you some examples in a few slides so you can see exactly what this may look like. Finally, the last practice we'll go over is using empowerment techniques. This is really powerful practice when working with individuals who have experienced systemic barriers such as racism in employment, healthcare access, and public services. Working in partnership with consumers instead of just dictating practices to them will empower them with the skills, systemic knowledge, and tools they need to advocate for themselves. And once again, we'll get into what that may look like. So our first practice is having an affirming agency culture. This can take on different forms such as internal and external statements, policies, announcements, and job postings. Here's an example of a mission statement that includes anti-racist, anti-oppressive language. The same can be done with job postings, social media posts, and agency website posts in response to large events. The agency's internet presence can give you an idea of their policies on equity and inclusion, and are publicly available for everyone to see, including potential or current consumers. This may seem small, but it isn't uncommon for folks to look your agency up online to see what type of environment you're providing to your consumers or what stances are on important topics may directly affect them. Similarly, when individuals walk into an office, they're looking for signs that they're welcome and represented. What pamphlets and flyers are visible, and who is represented on them? Does the staff represent cultures and populations that are being served? What type of artwork is being displayed? These are examples of having an inclusive environment. Having a stated commitment to equity and inclusion in policies and procedures and employee manuals shows a commitment to anti-oppressive practices. Declaring a commitment to supporting anti-racist work and integrating that declaration and its practices in all printed and published materials will affirm the commitment. Publish policies and procedures and employee manuals that discuss a commitment to anti-racist and anti-oppressive practices ensures the consumers and staff that the agency is holding itself accountable and that they can be referenced when incidences or challenges arrive. Posted participant expectations also promotes fostering an environment of inclusivity and lets staff and consumers know that the space is safe and standards to ensure the safety will be upheld. Also, having a commitment to diversity in staff will inherently reflect the larger population that you serve. Being aware of gaps in services for specific groups and creating positions in response to those needs, such as language capacity, cultural capacity, age, race, and gender sexual orientation diversity, can be a benefit to your consumers. Finally, providing outlets and growth opportunities and having discussions around anti-racist and anti-oppressive practices should be an integral part of agency culture. This doesn't mean to discuss these topics at an annual training or during quarterly meetings. This means really integrating these values into all program implementation and daily tasks. Each of these practices build the blueprints for affirming and responsiveness to your community. As a diverse staff, leaning on each other for support and having honest, constructive conversations about harm reduction and best practices is crucial. Recognizing each other's strengths to better serve the community and build trust and affirmation within your team will create a more positive and affirming culture for all. Those are some good examples of how to provide an affirming agency culture. So let's look next at ways that we can decenter English in communication with EAL consumers. What we mean by decentering English is shifting away from the English language as the dominant form of communication when it's not necessary. This isn't to say that we don't try to use English for those who are learning and want to practice, but to meet individuals where they're at in their English journey, if possible. This is especially important during the beginning of service when we're building rapport with a consumer. So what are some ways that we can decenter English in communication? You may already use some of these forms of communication in everyday practice. Examples like using nonverbal cues such as pointing, shrugging, nodding, and hand gestures really convey a lot, so use them when necessary. Next, we can use active listening. Even if you can't understand everything, make an effort to be very present and focused on who is speaking. Some tips for active listening are asking for clarification, not multitasking, and not interrupting. Also, you can use visuals in communication, like drawings, bringing up pictures that illustrate what you're referring to, or pointing at objects. Next, providing ample time to communicate is understandably not always possible if we've got a heavy schedule or we're short-staffed, but when we do have it, try to make sure that you are providing enough time with your EAL consumers to be able to use non-traditional forms of communication, like translation services. A couple of other tips is avoiding correcting grammar unless asked. I know a lot of times this can feel like you're being helpful, but it can also be perceived as criticism or ridicule. There will be consumers who ask you to do this ahead of time if they are wanting help with grammar and vocabulary, but it's always important to have that conversation first before offering corrections. And finally, just acknowledging efforts of others to speak a foreign language can really encourage and be beneficial to the consumer and the relationship you're trying to establish with them. It's hard and nerve-wracking, and it takes bravery to speak a language you aren't fluent in. People can be very encouraged or discouraged to speak a new language, so keep that in mind when you see somebody trying to make the effort. By decentering English and using other forms of communication, we can build rapport by showing we are willing to communicate without demanding they speak English if they're not at a comfortable level. It also shows openness, as many immigrants, migrants, and refugees have a history of experiencing oppression, discrimination, and even ridicule. This is especially true when working in government agencies. Starting with an openness to communicate can provide a lot of brevity for the consumer, and also helps build trust and confidence in the services that we're providing. The last practice we're going to go over is empowerment theory. I prefaced this term a bit, but let's flesh out what empowerment theory is and how we can use it to best serve consumers. Empowerment theory is a practice that includes the individuals and community you are serving in the process of program implementation, decision-making for their pathways to success, and gives them a voice to advocate for themselves, their families, and their communities. It is the difference between delegating tasks or making independent decisions about their service and involving them in the process of those services. Empowerment practices are methods of partnering with the consumer as much as possible with their participation in the programs they join. In other words, instead of just doing something for a consumer and providing them with the end product, showing them the process can give them knowledge to help them make more educated decisions on the services they're accessing. This can lead to several possible changes for them. First, it can help them identify their strengths they possess or areas where they can grow. It can give them the knowledge they need to gain partnerships with local resources. It can help them understand the systems they're using and how to navigate them, and it gives them the ability to make informed decisions that affect the positive changes in their lives. Using empowerment theory can help you understand the importance and effectiveness of partnering with consumers to help them achieve their goals. While you are the expert on the resources available and how to navigate systems, consumers are the experts on their own lives, their wants, needs, cultural values, and overall well-being. Empowerment practices help those we serve gain autonomy over their lives, have a say in how they receive services, and provide input on the programs they become involved in. For migrants and refugees, empowerment practices can be especially helpful as they face many challenges in their new environments such as culture shock, adjustment, language barriers, and oppression and discrimination. Giving them the proper tools they need to cross those barriers can be very affirming and beneficial to their success in their new home. A good way to look at empowerment practices is considering your role as a guide on the side. What this means is that you are there for support when needed and requested, but ultimately the consumers are the ones who will need to make the decisions that affect their role in the programs. Being a guide on the side means stepping in when consumers are struggling and in need of help with tasks, paperwork, or certain responsibilities, but allowing them to take the reins when they are capable. Being a guide on the side is trauma-informed because it acknowledges trauma an individual or group may have faced from places of authority and challenges power imbalances between service providers and community members. Being a guide on the side means you are there for support when they need it, but they are ultimately steering the wheel of the decision-making process that affects their lives. It is a collaborative process instead of a hierarchical one, and emphasizes a partnership rather than a directive. Again, you are the expert on resources and how to navigate systems the community members use. They are the experts on their own lives, their wants, needs, goals, traditions, etc. Ultimately, it is their lives being affected by the services provided. Working to dismantle common opinions and misconceptions of EAL individuals, migrants, immigrants, and refugees by partnering with them in their service promotes anti-racist and anti-oppressive practices. I hope this training gave you some new things to think about and to explore, and I thank you so much for being here. Have a great day.